Okay, well, welcome everyone to How Are You Doing with Your Fundraising Really webinar. And this is an exciting topic for me to talk about. I always love talking about assessing your development program and development plans because it's one of the first things I learned when I entered the field of development, and I learned how important having a solid development plan and being able to evaluate your development programs really were. So just a few ground rules for the webinar for those of you who may be just joining us. We are live, we're being recorded, and you will get a recording of this webinar afterwards, so you don't have to sit down and take a lot of frantic notes. I have a lot of material to cover in an hour, so I'm going to go at a pretty rapid pace, and I want to keep things moving. For those of you who don't know me, I want to just tell you a little bit about myself. And I always like to start with something personal. And you might be wondering, why on earth is she showing us a picture of boxing gloves autographed by Muhammad Ali? So, this, I have to tell you, was one of my very prized possessions. I've always been a big fan of Muhammad Ali ever since, believe it or not, I remember when he won the Olympics back in, I believe it was 1960. So I'm not a young chick anymore, obviously. But Muhammad Ali has always been someone that I really looked up to and admired. And I got these gloves from my husband, I believe it was my 65th birthday. He bought me these boxing gloves autographed by Muhammad Ali. And they were one of my very prized possessions, which I actually just passed along to one of my great granddaughters who's also a Muhammad Ali fan, so I thought it would be nice for her to have them. But the reason that this, I think, relates to what we're talking about today, believe it or not, is one of the reasons I'm really admired Muhammad Ali, and I'm tell you, I'm not a sports person. I don't watch football, baseball, basketball, but I love boxing, and I think the reason I like boxing is because it's not just about how tough you are and how big and how strong you are, but it's a lot about strategy and knowing what your opponent is doing. And this is something that I think I've always admired about Muhammad Ali because his skill, certainly he was a big guy and tough and had quite a punch, but he also had the strategy to watch his opponents and really kind of dance around them and sometimes really aggravate his opponents. But I think it just goes to show to me how important evaluation is. So that's why I'm showing you a pair of Muhammad Ali boxing gloves and sharing a little bit about my personal interest. Those of you, most of you probably know me and you're familiar with my work, but just to give you a little bit about my professional background, I've been in the development field for more than 30 years as a staff person and as a consultant. And I'm also the author of more books than I actually can count anymore. I think it's about 20 some that I've either authored or co-authored. But here are some samples of some of the things that kind of relate to the topic today. The development plan was one of my very early books. It was published, I think, in 2005, or I'm sorry, it was before that, 1995 or somewhere around there. The Leaky Bucket, which I co-authored with Ellen Bristol, and I'm going to talk about the Leaky Bucket a little bit in this session. And then creating your development plan, the Charity Channel's Quick Guide to Creating Your Development Plan, which I co-authored with another great colleague of mine, Margaret Gulick. So those are just some of the books that I have out and those that relate to what we're here to talk about. So why are you here? Well, I think you're here in the right place if you feel that you can't really create a development plan that works because you're not quite sure how to measure your success. So maybe you don't know where you are to start with, and it's hard to plan for the future if you don't know where you start with. So we're going to be talking later on towards the end of this webinar about a special bonus offer that will help you figure out why your development plans never got implemented and learn how to get started and who needs to be involved. We'll be talking about a little bit of this today, but what a comprehensive plan should look like and how to implement and evaluate the plan. So today's webinar, we're going to be focused on evaluation and assessment. That's really what our goal is today. So in the meantime, if you have a chance to go into the chat box, if you haven't found it by now, I would encourage you to find the chat box and just type in a simple yes or no. Do you have a written development plan? Or maybe you have one that nobody knows where it is anymore, or maybe you haven't looked at it for a while, or maybe you haven't and you've just kind of given up on it. So if you take a few minutes to go to that chat box and just let us know whether or not you have a written development plan, we'll see what the overwhelming majority of people on the call are thinking. Maybe some of you are having trouble finding the chat room because I don't see too many responses. There's some starting to come in. Someone says she's working on it. Lisa said she's working on her development plan. She doesn't have one now, so great timing for you, Lisa. I don't know if anyone else has wants to jump in. And maybe you don't even know if you have a development plan. Somebody else, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right. Mara Carmen is working on it. And Kara has one. She has a plan already. So, well, you can feel free to add your list to that. I want to move on. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But what I find is many people have a plan, but they haven't really implemented it or don't know if it's the right plan for them. So I think that's why I asked that question, just to kind of get an idea where you are. So what you're going to learn in this webinar is a couple different things. First of all, why having a plan is important. I think this is a huge step for many organizations, just knowing why they even have a plan. Somebody else just answered our poll that they have one, but it's dated, so they don't really feel like they have an accurate plan, and that's certainly understandable. I find many people in that position. They have a plan and nobody ever looked at it, or they put it in the shelf a long time ago. Another thing that you're going to learn, and this is the focus of our webinar today, is what you need to evaluate before you begin your plan, because the first step in planning is knowing where you are. And I think this is why a lot of people don't have a plan, because they're not quite sure what's working and what isn't working already. So they don't really know what to plan for in the future. So that's something that we're going to be talking about. We're also going to talk about why it's so hard for nonprofits to assess their fundraising programs. And I think this is really one of the reasons that a lot of people don't do assessment, is they don't know where to start. And assessment and evaluation can be so complex, and you sometimes get stuck in what we call analysis paralysis, where you spend all your time evaluating and no plan implementing, and that's not good either. You don't want to spend all your time looking at measures and never working with those measures and taking them to make things better. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about how you use your findings to create a development plan that works. Because, like I said, finding out what's wrong, or maybe what you're doing right even, is only going to give you certain answers, but then you have to decide, well, what are we going to do with those answers? How are we going to make things better? And that's the goal of all development planning, is to improve your development program as you go on. So I'm guessing that most of you, and based on your chat answers, I think I'm pretty true here, that most of you attended this webinar either because you don't have a plan at all, or maybe you have one, but it just isn't working. You've maybe set unrealistic goals, or maybe you didn't set enough goals, or you set too many and you just found that you couldn't work on everything at one time because you were going kind of crazy as you were doing that. And some of you perhaps have a plan, but you don't get buy-in. I can't tell you how many people I've heard say, well, I spent all this time creating this great development plan, but my board or my CEO doesn't help me implement it. They just think it's all my responsibility. And the answer to that is usually they're not helping you implement it because they weren't involved from the very beginning in developing the plan. So if this is some of the things that give you headaches, and you look a little bit like this guy here who's holding his head and not quite sure where to turn next, I want you to kind of relax for the next hour while we go through some of this information. And I have a lot of interesting photos in here. Some of the photos that you see are, stock photos, but this is one. A couple of years ago, I was invited to go to Bermuda to speak at the Center on Philanthropy, and it was a great experience. This was one of the scenes from the beach in Bermuda, so I found it very relaxing being there, and I hope you'll kind of relax for the next hour and uh, really learn a lot about how you assess your development program. So why is it important to assess your development program? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, funding sources are expecting more bang for their buck. You know, years ago, I think individuals especially, and even businesses and foundations to some degree, would fund an organization because they thought, well, this is a great organization. It's been around for a long time. And maybe some of you work for some big national organizations like Red Cross or Big Brothers or Boys and Girls Clubs or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or any of those big national organizations. And sometimes people do give just because they know the organization's been around a while and does good work. But today, most funding sources, including even individuals, are saying, well, what is this organization doing with my money? And am I really getting the most bang for my buck by investing in them, or should I be investing in someone else? So it's very important that you understand whether your program is successful or not. And boards seem to have greater expectations by far. I don't know about you, but I've been on staff and I've attended a lot of board meetings as a consultant. And a lot of times I hear boards just making demands and expectations of the development office. They're really not very realistic. And sometimes even organizations feel, well, development is dispensable. We can't, if we're having a shortfall in funding, we can't cut our programs because that's why we exist. So cutting the development staff is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's one of my mother's favorite sayings that she used to say to me all the time. And sometimes we tend to do that. And I've seen, especially during the recession, I happen to live in Las Vegas, and the recession way back earlier in this century really hit the Las Vegas community very hard. We really suffered. Our real estate values went way downhill. Now they're climbing back up again. But a lot of times when organizations felt this dollar crunch, they would get rid of the people who raised the money, which doesn't make sense, but it happened a lot of times. So if you can't prove that development is worth the effort for your organization, some organizations actually just feel like, well, we can get rid of the development department. We can't afford them. So if you again can find that chat box, I'd like to just get a quick poll here on how you evaluate your development results. Do you evaluate them at all? And some people don't. Some only look at the results at the end of the year. Their fiscal year ends and they say, gosh, you know, we didn't raise as much as we hoped to raise in grants, or our special event didn't do as great, or our direct mail did wonderful this year. That's great. We raised more money than we expected to. Some monitor things on a monthly basis or maybe even more often than that. And then some monitor progress before, during, and after every event and activity, which obviously is the ideal. I know it sounds like a lot, and you think, well, how do I evaluate progress before the event? But you can tell as you're planning an event or an activity. So oftentimes you can tell what's going to work and what isn't working. So Calvin said his organization monitors on a monthly basis, so that's great. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime into our chat box and let us know how they're doing. So maybe that means the rest of you aren't evaluating at all, or you're just not quite sure. Some Lisa says at the end of the year. Oh, and Joanne says monthly plus a critique after every event. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. But Kara says quarterly. So those are some mixed responses, but good to know that nobody said no, they don't evaluate at all. So that's good news. I'm glad to hear that. So let's move on and talk about the evaluation. And there's several different ways you can evaluate success. And I'm going to talk about both of these. First, there's a full-blown development audit where you engage someone else to come in and look at your development program and tell you what's working and what isn't working and what you could be doing better. And then there's self-evaluation. And I'm not saying either one of those is right or wrong, because there are times when both of those are useful. And the reason I have pictures of pills and a doctor here, is because I kind of evaluate this as the way we treat our bodies. For instance, I sometimes have sinus problems, and I might wake up in the morning and think, oh, my sinuses are really killing me today. So I'll use some nasal spray and occasionally even maybe take it. I don't usually take medicine for it, but I use some essential oils and I'll take some nasal spray and things like that. But if I start getting really bad headaches and I know I really need help, and I'm starting to get sore throats and coughing and everything else that I know are coming from my sinuses, then I'll go to a doctor and seek help. And I think that's a lot of the way I look at a development evaluation. There are many things that you can do yourself, so I'm going to talk to you about what you can do to evaluate yourself and when it might be appropriate for you to go engage someone to do a full-blown development audit, and that might just be what some of you are ready for at this point in time. So let's talk first about what needs to be evaluated, because a lot of times when people think about evaluating their programs, all they think about is, okay, how much money did we raise and how much money did it cost us to raise this? And they only focus on the actual development programs, but there's a lot of things that are interrelated with development that need to be evaluated too. So first of all, you need to evaluate your infrastructure, which includes, there's other things that you could include with infrastructure, but basically it includes the fundraising software that you have or don't have, and is it working for you or isn't it working? Is it time to get some training on it, or is it time to maybe replace that system with something else? The policies and procedures that you have in place are either going to help or hinder you in your development efforts. And then your case for support. Do you have one? Do you use it? Is it up to date? All those things need to be evaluated. And then you also want to evaluate your donor relationships, because you may sometimes never communicate with donors when you're not asking for money. And that's something that you should really look at. How often do we communicate with our donors? Maybe we're communicating too often and they get tired of hearing from us, or maybe we're not communicating enough. Are we letting them know how their money was used? Are we thanking donors promptly and accurately? And how do we recognize donors? So that's something that needs to be evaluated. And we're going to talk more about all of these things. Awareness. Does your community know about your organization? And you might be surprised. I've worked with some organizations that really are part of a big national association, and they think, well, everybody knows what we do. And you go out and start talking to the community and you find out nobody knows what your organization does, or if they do, maybe they have the wrong perception. And I don't know if it's bad to say this, but some people believe that any publicity is good publicity because at least you're getting publicity. But maybe sometimes bad publicity can hurt you. But what kind of tools are you using to create awareness? So that's something that you want to evaluate. And then, of course, your development program. This is the obvious thing, but what kinds of fundraising are you doing? Are you incorporating different methods? Are you measuring each method to see which ones are successful and which ones aren't? And then do you incorporate that analysis into your development plan? If you're doing some special events, is something that comes to my mind because somebody mentioned it in the chat room. A lot of times people do events year after year because it's tradition. We got to keep doing it. You know, we've always done this event, and they find that attendance is dropping, the net revenues are dropping, but it's tradition. We got to keep doing it. And sometimes you have to take a look at these events and say, you know, maybe it's time that we do think about getting rid of some of these events and changing them up or improving them or getting rid of them. We also want to evaluate human resources. Do you have the right people in the right seats on the bus? And what you're going to be evaluating is the board, the staff, and volunteers. All of these should be involved in your fundraising efforts. And I know many of you don't utilize volunteers at all in your fundraising. I highly recommend that you consider doing that. Maybe your board isn't involved in fundraising because they don't know how to do fundraising. That's another whole topic that I could talk for several hours about. And do you have the right staff doing development? So those are things that you're going to be evaluating. So let's talk about some of these in a little more depth, because these are the areas that I find a lot of people don't really analyze. First of all, in the infrastructure department is your donor software. Do you have donor software to start with? I guess that's the first question. There are some people still trying to manage development programs using Excel or some kind of a spreadsheet, which was not designed to do donor relations. It was designed for financial reporting. And yes, you can report your total donations on Excel, but it's not going to help you build donor relationships. So do you have a software that's really doing what you want? Do you want to get a web-based software, which most people seem to be leaning towards these days, rather than a proprietary package that you might pay $50,000 for, and then you have it in your organization, but only one person can use it? I think those days are pretty much gone. So most people are going now to the web-based development programs. Now, how do you have that software coded? How do you have donors coded in there? Do you know which donors are volunteers, former board members, people who attended your events, those kind of things? Those things all should be coded in there, because the donor software is more than just recording gifts and thanking people. It's about helping you build donor relations. So the better you can code, and what kind of reporting do you get out of it? Do you have the right kind of reporting that your board and your volunteers and maybe your CEO will want to be aware of? And do you have the staff trained to use this? That's the nice thing about the newer development software programs, is you don't need to go 2 weeks to somewhere across the country to train in using software. Most of the newer ones are very user friendly, and it's like learning to use your new iPhone. Nobody goes to school for that. But is your staff able to use the software, or do they need some kind of training in it? And what's your budget for software? If you want to buy a new system, can you afford to buy one? And there's a lot of very inexpensive systems out there today. But those are things that you have to evaluate and look at your software honestly, and let your board and your executive staff know if it's not working, that you need something that's going to improve productivity but help you build better donor relations too. The policies and procedures that you have, do you have all these things in place? Gift acceptance policies. And I talk to many people that just say, oh, we take any gift we can get. Well, I could tell you a dozen stories about why you don't want the attitude of taking any gift you can get. I've known people have gotten a gift of a horse and had to worry about boarding it and feeding it. Gifts of real estate that they really don't want and don't want to be real estate managers. Gift of artwork that really they don't have any use for. There's a million different things that people can get as gifts. So it's not just the gift itself, but who gives the gift. Maybe you have policies about not taking gifts from certain categories of businesses or individuals. Do you have investment policies? If you raise money, for example, for an endowment fund or a capital campaign, you might be bringing money in before you're ready to spend it. So you might need investment policies. Do you have office procedures on basic things like who receives the gift? Where does the check go? Does it come directly to the development office? Does it go to the finance office? Who opens the mail? Who gets the checks in the bank? Who records it and reports it and sends out the thank you letter? All of those things really need to be evaluated. And then, do you have a development budget? I'm amazed at how many organizations say, well, we don't even have a budget for our development office, which can be a real disaster, because you definitely are going to need a budget. It takes money to make money. That's what they always used to say, and it's very true. You've got to invest in development. And then your case for support, and again, this could be another whole category that I could talk for a couple hours about, but do you have a case for your organization? Is it up to date? Are people using it? Is it well written? Does it really tell your story in a powerful way? And we have webinar coming up on that sometime in the future, so we'll talk more about that then. Awareness of your organization. What does your website look like? That needs to be evaluated. Is it user-friendly? Do you have a place that people can donate? Can they download information easily? Can they maybe sign up for events or volunteer or something? Are you using social media to create awareness? And social media isn't usually the best thing for fundraising, but it is fantastic for creating awareness. So that's something that you want to have in place. What kind of media relations do you have? Do the press and the TV and radio stations in your community even know who you are? Do they have information? Have you prepared press kits? Do you do press releases? What is the relationship between PR and development in your organization? Sometimes it's all one department and one person is responsible for all, but PR and development go so closely hand in hand that you really need to have a good working relationship with the PR people. Do you publish an annual report, and what does it look like? I just looked at one of my clients' annual reports and I was disappointed to see that they didn't have their donor listing in there. And your 990 form, that's really a financial thing, but it also can be used to create awareness if you're in the United States. I know we have some people who are not in the US, so you can ignore that statement. But the 990 forms in the US are all available to anyone online anytime. They just go to GuideStar and they can download your 990 form. So you should be using that as a way to create awareness of your organization too. And then the integrated development program, you know, the old adage about don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if you drop the basket, they're all broken. But it's true that many of us put all our development eggs in one basket and we rely strictly on one type of fundraising. We do nothing but grant writing, or we do nothing but special events, or we only do direct mail. And that's a big mistake, because you want to evaluate the fact that you have an integrated development program. So what I mean by that is you should be doing all of these things. Obviously, grants are important, especially for some organizations. Some don't rely much on grants, and that's fine, but you should at least be examining what grant opportunities are out there, and if they're appropriate for your organization, go ahead and look at that. Special events, and this is something that sometimes when we ask people if they're have an integrated program, they say, oh yeah, we have a lot of sources of funding, but those sources of funding turn out to be 12 special events that they run every year. So their source of funding is really one source, special events. Do you use direct response, telephone and direct mail and email? Do you use social media? As I said, that's better more for creating awareness, but it can be used successfully for fundraising. Do you have a major gift program? Have you done a capital campaign, or maybe you're in a need for one? Do you have a plan giving program? And there's other things that we could add to this mix, but you really need to have a cross section. So all of your funding isn't coming from one particular source, because if you lose that major donor or that major grant funder, or that special event turns out to be a disaster, like one of my clients who had a big special event that they counted on for 75% of their budget, and they were in the northeast part of the country, and one year they had it during it was worse than a snowstorm. It was a major blizzard that closed down all the roads and everything else. So obviously they had to cut back their budget because they relied on that one special event for everything. So that's why having your eggs spread out in a bunch of different baskets is going to be much more productive. The other way to look at this is, are you reaching all your constituents? Not only different methods, but are you contacting individuals? Are you contacting foundations? And I didn't put the government in here because some people do get government funding, but it's not really considered philanthropic dollars. Corporations and businesses, organizations. You really need to evaluate, are all of your sources of funding coming from one particular area? And if they are, that can be bad for you too, because you don't want to have all of your resources coming from one particular area. You really should have things spread out. And if you've seen the Giving USA charts, you know that about 80% of giving in the United States comes from individuals, and I think Canada has pretty similar results. About 15% come from foundations and about 5 from corporations, and they don't even count organizations and businesses outside the corporation arena. But you really need to have a mix of constituents that you're raising money from. And then the other thing you want to evaluate is, what are your long range development plans? Because if you're creating a development plan that's only looking for this year ahead, you might need to start focusing on some long-term needs. Maybe you have capital needs and you're going to have to start preparing now for a capital campaign that you might be doing 2 or 3 years down the road. Or you might have endowment needs. Maybe you want to start raising money for your endowment to assure the future success of your organization. And some people really like giving to endowments for that reason. And then you want to evaluate your human resources, your board, your staff, your volunteers, and how are they all involved in fundraising. The board should absolutely be 100% giving to your organization and should be involved at some level of fundraising. And your staff, do you have enough staff to really do what's expected? Sometimes people create these great development plans, and then when they look at it and break it out with what they have to do every month, it's impossible to do it with one staff person. So it might be that you need to engage more volunteers. It might be that you need to engage your board more, or you might need to hire additional staff if you really want to succeed in your development plan. So I want to talk a little bit about how you go about evaluating these things. Well, there's a lot of things that you can evaluate yourself. I put this little clip art in here because I thought it was appropriate to think about. Years ago, when we drove a car, we had to always be making sure that we had enough gas. Well, today we don't have to do that because guess what? The car does it for us. I just look at my little thing on my dashboard that says how many miles I have to go, and I just bought a hybrid car, and I love it because I get in and fill it up with gas, and it says I have 600 miles to drive on that gas tank, which is fantastic. And of course, the light is going to come on when you're down to probably 40 or 50 gallons in your tank, or 40 or 50 miles to go. It's going to come on and say, oh, it's time to stop for gas. So we don't have to do a lot of stuff ourselves anymore, but there are some things that you can do yourself. One is knowing your development history. And if you're new to the organization, spend some time looking at history. And if your organization doesn't have that history, you might have to go grab some verbal history from some of the people who were involved if that's the only thing available. But review your strategic plan and your development plan and really take a good look at those. And then a SWOT analysis and reviewing your budget. Those are some things that you can do on your own. So I want to kind of focus on talking a little bit about those. So let's start with your development history. This is where your software comes in, because everything you do should be tracked in that software. You should be tracking your direct mail, your telephone, your internet responses. How many people did you mail to or email to or call? How many responded? How many upgraded their gifts? How many said no this year and you lost a gift? Donor retention is a real important measurement tool. Your special events, you need to evaluate those. And you can actually evaluate, I have a special event tool that I find really helpful that helps people when they're playing an event, what's your anticipated revenue? And then you can go back and look at the event after the fact and say, well, did we raise that much in revenue? And what was our net? Maybe our expenses were higher than we thought they were going to be. So you need to evaluate all this and track it in your software system so that you don't have to go back and sift through 25 pounds of paper and talk to 16 different people to find out whether an event was really successful or not. Your grant proposals, how many did you send out? How many were funded? Out of the ones that weren't funded, did you call and find out why? And did you track that in your software system so you know the answer to that? Major gifts, how many major gift prospects do you have on your list? What do you even consider a major gift? And how many of those people came in to your organization new this year? How many maybe have you lost for one reason or another? Planned gifts can also be tracked in your software, if you have a planned gift expectancy, you know someone has written you into their will, but they're still living, at least you should make a note of that in your software so that you know when that person does leave this earth, you can follow through on that. And capital campaigns. I do a lot of capital campaigns, and what I find is when I go into an organization and they say to me, oh yeah, we did a capital campaign 10 years ago, and I ask for the records from that campaign because I want to see who the donors were, who the volunteers were. Oh, well, I don't know if we have those records. Let's see, they might be in our storage unit or something. Those kind of things all should be tracked in your software system. And your volunteer results. If you are using volunteers in fundraising, I know a lot of people aren't, but if you are, you want to track which volunteers are really doing a good job and which ones maybe you don't want to get involved in your fundraising in the future because they haven't really followed through. So those things are important to track too. So it's not just about how much money you're raising. And then, do your program outcomes fall within acceptable standards? And these are kind of arbitrary standards, but people have done research and found that acquisition mailings typically, as you know, probably cost more than you raise. Most of the time you spend $1.25 to $1.50 for every dollar you raise in an acquisition mailing. But you should be tracking that so you know if you're spending a lot more than that, maybe there's something wrong. And if you're spending less, that's great. Maybe you need to do more mailings. When you do direct mail renewals, mailing to people who already have given to your organization, your costs are much lower, like 20 to 25 cents for every dollar raised. Special events typically cost about 50 cents for every dollar raised, which is one of the reasons that I'm not particularly keen on doing special events unless they're really used to create awareness of your organization. And foundation proposals usually have a pretty low cost basis, and most of that comes in the research tools that you need to do foundation proposals. And personal solicitation, of course, is the lowest cost because they're usually done with very little expense involved. But take a look at your costs for all the different types of fundraising you do and see if it does meet some of these guidelines. Reviewing your strategic plan, and some organizations I know don't even have a strategic plan, so that's, if yours is one of those, I would encourage you to get a strategic plan in place as soon as possible. But have you included development strategies in that plan? The strategic plan is different from your development plan because it talks about every aspect of your organization. Your programs, do you need to add programs, delete programs, your facility, your human resources? It really encompasses everything about your organization. But in both the development plan and the strategic plan, you have to have realistic goals. So make sure that the goals of your strategic plan are realistic. It's something that you can actually accomplish. And is your development plan part of that? Because it should be. The strategic plan guides your organization as to where it's going, but you also need to have a development plan that says, okay, here's how we're going to get there. So your development plan, if you have one, here's what you should do to evaluate it. Look at your last development plan, even if it was a couple years ago, and say, okay, were the goals based on past performance, or did we just set up some arbitrary goals? And I know the first time you do a development plan and the first time you've done development in your organization, it's going to be a little bit harder to set goals, but it can be done. But if you have past performance at all, and most organizations do, look at whether or not your goals really match that. If you are now raising $10,000 a year, you probably don't want to set a goal to raise $1 million next year because it's just not going to be realistic based on your past performance. Did you have too many goals? Or maybe you had too few goals. Maybe you only focused your goals in one area. We're going to write more grants this year. Well, that's fine, but what else are you going to do for fundraising? Did the entire development staff participate in your planning process? You know, if you have a large staff or even a medium-sized staff, it's not just the director of development that's responsible. You need to talk to the other folks in your department as well as people who are not in your development department to make sure that what you're planning is going to be realistic. And was your budget realistic? Everything that has a budget attached to it, if you haven't included your CFO in this planning process, they might come back to you and say, well, this is a great plan, but we don't have the money to do any of this, so sorry, you might as well throw it away. So you've got to include your CEO and your CFO from the very beginning. Was your timeline realistic? Can you really accomplish everything you want to do? And I find one of the biggest problems that people have when they do development plans and strategic plans is that they get over enthusiastic and want to do everything in the first 3 months or the first 6 months, and it's just, impossible. You're putting too many demands on people. So be realistic with your timeline. Were there sufficient human resources to implement your plan? You can have the greatest plans in the world, but if you don't have the staff and the board and the volunteers behind it, it's not going to happen. You should also do a SWOT analysis of your development office. And most of us have done these in conjunction with our strategic planning, where we look at the organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But do this just with your development office, maybe your development staff, or if you have a development committee on your board, you can sit down and say, well, what are the strengths of our office? Well, we have a great software program. Okay, well, maybe one of our weaknesses is nobody's using it and we're not really keeping it up to date. An opportunity might be a new opportunity for funding. Maybe you have a new business that moved into your community and this is an opportunity to raise money, or maybe you've never solicited businesses at all, so that's an opportunity, or maybe there are foundation opportunities available, or individuals. Threats could be maybe two companies that only supported you now merge, and now threat is you lost funding because now instead of 2 people to approach, you only have 1. So do a SWOT analysis strictly of development, and it might be quite interesting to you. And then look at your budget. First of all, who develops your budget? And if you as the development director are not involved in developing your own budget, I think your organization is making a huge mistake, because a budget isn't something that your CFO comes in and says, okay, here's our income for the year and here's our expenses and here's our deficit, so you go raise the money. That's not a very realistic way to set a development budget. So you want to be realistic about this. And it, as I said before, it does cost money to raise money. And one of the things that I find is boards are always concerned about, oh, we're spending so much money in development. Do we really need to spend that money on software? And do we need that research tools? And do we need to go to those seminars? And what they should be looking at is, are they investing enough money into development? Because that is what causes a lot of development offices to fail, is nobody's making an investment. So of course they're failing because they don't have the resources that they need to raise the money. One of the things that I'm going to give you a tool you'll be getting after this recording ends, you're going to get the recording, and one of the tools I'm giving you is called a philanthropic profile assessment, because I really believe that a lot of development offices fail because they don't have a strong culture of philanthropy in their organization. So some of the questions on here might seem a little odd to you, like where is your development office located? But believe it or not, that does make a difference in whether or not people have a feeling that you really care about fundraising and philanthropy. So if your development officer is sharing an office with 6 other people in a cubicle, how willing do you think a major donor is going to be to come in and talk to that development officer about a major gift if they're in a big office with 6 other staff people? So those things I think are really important. And yes, somebody just asked me if the recording is available, and yes, I will send you a link to the recording and some of the other materials as soon as this webinar ends. So that's good to know. I'm glad I had a chance to remind you of that. So there's one tool that I'm going to give you the link to this shortly, but I mentioned the book that I co-authored called The Leaky Bucket, What's Wrong with Your Fundraising and How to Fix It. And this is a very simple assessment. It's not a comprehensive development audit by any means. It's based on 9 criteria, and I certainly will invite you to take that. This is a bonus. It's free, and you can find out where you rank on that, and I'd be happy to discuss your rankings after you take it. So I'm going to give you that link in a few minutes. But also, I want you to review your governance. Is your board large enough? Is it made up of the right people? Do your board members contribute? Do they attend and involve themselves in your organization? What kind of board recruitment process do you have? What kind of board education process? What kind of committee structure do you have? And do you have a strong development or fundraising committee as well? The board self-assessment, those are things that you can do with your organization. So reviewing your staff is another thing that's really critical. What is the size of your development staff? Maybe it's one person, maybe it's half a person, maybe it's you and you have other duties besides development. What is your staff involved in? Are they involved in really doing the right things? Some of you may have heard the 95-5 rule, that 5% of the people or entities are responsible for 95% of your funding, and that's very true in a lot of organizations. It started out being the 80-20 rule, and in the years that I've been in development, it morphed into the 90-10 and then the 95-5 rule. So I think this is really an important rule, that many times our staff is busy doing things that focus on the 95% of the people who are only giving you 5% of your funding. So you need to make sure your staff is focused on the right directions. You need, if you have a large development office, you need an organizational chart that makes it clear as to who's doing what. And they need to have professional development. Even though maybe you've been in this field for 30 years like I have, there are always new things coming along, and I always have to keep improving my own education so I can help other people. And professional development is really critical for your staff, so that's something that you should evaluate. And are you working with fundraising volunteers? And there are ways, I'm going to have a whole webinar on this topic in the future too, but you should be involving your volunteers in planning solicitations and cultivating donors and actually soliciting donors and in stewarding them. And I highly recommend a development committee that's not just board members, but maybe 2 or 3 board members and then a bunch of people from the community, because it's going to take a lot more than just the staff that you have and the board that you have to really do a strong development program. And I'm a huge believer in involving volunteers in all the aspects of your fundraising, which you'll learn more about when I do that webinar. So I promised you some tools to help you, and I mentioned the leaky bucket assessment. As I said, this is free of charge, and I gave you the link, and you'll be getting the PowerPoint individually besides the recording. So you'll be able to look at that code, and you can use the code Linda Webinar when you take that assessment. So you can get a good idea of what it looks like, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it. I'm also giving you that philanthropic profile assessment after the webinar, and then we're going to talk in a few minutes about a course that expands on this webinar a great deal. So those who sign up for that course will get an extra bonus, and that's the board fundraising assessment form. So I want to talk a little bit about a full-blown development audit. I mentioned this earlier, and some of you may not be familiar with the concept and what it's all about. And some of you may have done a development audit. Some of you may have heard about it, but you think we can't afford it. But can you afford not to do it? Some of you might think, well, we don't have the time to do that. And some of you may say, well, we want to do it yourselves. Well, as I said, there's a lot of things you can do yourself. But when you have that little bit of a headache in the morning from your sinuses or tension or whatever it is, yeah, you can take an aspirin yourself. But if you wake up with crushing migraine headaches every morning and you think, oh my gosh, maybe I have a brain tumor, I think you want to get to a doctor. So that's kind of how I look at a development audit. There are a lot of things you can do yourself, but sometimes it is good to think about having someone else come in and do it. The answer to how much it costs, well, it's hard to say. I would encourage you to talk to different consultants, but probably if you're a fairly large or medium-sized organization, you might be paying $25,000 or $50,000 to do a full-blown development audit. If you're a smaller organization, you might be able to do it for less. And some organizations really don't have that much to audit because they're new at fundraising. So in many cases, they don't need an audit. But if you're going to hire a consultant to do an audit, and it should always be done by an outsider, because this is something you can't really evaluate everything yourself. It's like doing your financial audit. You legally can't do that yourself. Legally, you could do a development audit, but in most cases, you're just too close to the scene to know that you can step back and be objective. And a consultant will have experience from a lot of different other organizations to compare your organization to as well. It typically takes maybe 3 or months, maybe more if you have a big staff, or if you're a big organization, maybe has different affiliates and you're doing all that relationships with it. But I would say most of the time you can have a development audit done in about 3 months. So if you're hiring a pro and con, the pros are, um, if you're hiring a consultant, is they're going to have the objectivity. They're not coming in there with any preconceived notions about, well, I know our grants are really sad. They're coming in there with total objectivity, and they're going to look at things from that 30,000-foot viewpoint. And they're going to have experience with their organization, and they're going to have knowledge. Hopefully, you're finding a consultant that has all of these things. And then there's always what we call the 50 miles in a briefcase rule, which sounds kind of silly, but I've been in a staff position, and I know this is true, that sometimes you could tell your board something over and over again and they don't listen to you, but they pay a consultant to travel 50 miles with a briefcase, and the consultant tells them the same thing. Oh, it must be true, the consultant said it. So unfortunately, there is some of that around, and I think many of you have probably experienced that. The cons, of course, are the cost and the time involved, although the time involved would probably take you even longer if you did it yourself. So not sure if that's really a con. So if you're going to hire a consultant, that doesn't mean you're totally off the hook, because you're still going to have to gather the information to give that consultant and probably meet with them a couple times, and maybe selling the project to the rest of your staff, even that you should be doing this, and then following through on this consultant recommendations. That, of course, is going to be a staff role. So is there another alternative? Well, it's funny you should ask, because I do have another thing that I can mention to you, is the virtual development audit. This is a product which is offered by Bristol Strategy Group, my co-author and the person who runs the leaky bucket assessment. I didn't develop the leaky bucket assessment, she did. But with a virtual audit, it's done without a lot of personal contact with the consultant. People fill out, your board members and your staff fill out forms that answer all the questions and surveys, and then the consultants will do this all virtually, and it's all automated, so it's fairly easy and it doesn't take as long. So if anybody's interested in that, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but you can contact me, and I'll make sure that you get information on that. So what does evaluating your development office do for your organization? Well, first of all, it's going to build confidence in your board and staff. Your board members and your executive director are going to feel a lot better about you once they see the result of what your organization is really capable of doing, and they understand that you are evaluating things. So I think it helps build confidence when people know, especially donors, know that you're evaluating things and you're not just doing things because you've always done it that way. One of those killer phrases that kills a lot of nonprofits. It allows you to spend your valuable time on the things that count. Sometimes I'm amazed, and if you've never done a time analysis, sometimes I'm just amazed at the amount of time that people spend on things that really aren't productive. They're spending a lot of time doing things that just don't benefit them. So having an evaluation of which programs are the most successful and which are the least successful allows you to focus your time on the things that really count. And of course, it helps your bottom line. Yes, it might cost you something to do some evaluation up front, but in the long run, you're going to be a much stronger development program because of this. And then it allows you to show your board of management which types of fundraising work. And that really makes you look good, because a lot of times board members don't realize that special events are so time consuming and volunteer intensive, and sometimes they drain the donors. They just get tired of coming to event after event. And they think, well, we're making good money on those events. But when they look at all the factors that go into it, you might be able to show them that, gosh, there are much better ways to raise money, and it's going to make us more money and cost us less in time, aggravation, and expenses. So that is one of the biggest key things of doing evaluation. So the final word about evaluation that I always like to quote is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So all of your fundraising needs to have a way to measure your success. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So why did you attend this webinar today? Well, as I said, probably a lot of you attended because you didn't know how to measure your program results, or maybe you're tired of doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. You know, that was one of Albert Einstein's quotes, that insanity is a definition of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Unfortunately, we do that in the nonprofit sector a lot. And maybe some board members are always saying, oh, well, let's run another event. We're short of our goal, so let's run another event. And you're just exhausted because you're doing nothing but events, and you want to change all that, but you're not quite sure where to start. So how do you change it? Well, you can just give up and say, well, I can't change it, I'm going on. But I think there's a better option. And what you can do today to really make a difference in this is, I've tried to really focus this webinar on a lot of different things, but there's so much more I could be telling you about. So I created a course called Creating a Development Plan That Works. And part of it is evaluation, but there's a lot more to it than that. And with this course, I think you can learn how to really build on the programs that are effective once you've done the evaluation, and eliminate the ones that aren't. So remember, I mentioned earlier that I was going to have a special offer. Well, I do have a special offer on this course. And actually, by now, you probably are receiving, if you haven't already received your email, that I sent out a coupon for this course. So you'll hear a little bit more about that. But if you're thinking about this course, it's for people who wonder why their development plans never do get implemented. They just sit on a shelf or in a computer file, never to be seen again, because of these factors. They didn't involve the right people in creating the plan. The goals weren't clear. There were no measurable action steps in place, or there were no metrics in place to measure success. So this course guides you through all of that. What you learn in this course is how you get started in creating a development plan, how you do that evaluation, and how you identify who should be involved in it. So we're going to talk about who needs to be involved in the planning process. And if you think it's just you sitting in your office, that would be the easy way to do it, but it won't get implemented because the right people weren't involved. And when I hear people say, well, I created this great plan, but nobody's helping me with it, well, the answer is they didn't help you create it. So, of course, they're not going to help you implement it either. And you'll find out what a comprehensive development plan should look like. We'll actually give you some samples of plans, and how to implement and evaluate your plan. So that's what's all covered in this course. It's actually a 4-week, I shouldn't say 4-week, it's a 4-lesson course, because some people get these courses and they take it all in 1 week because they really are anxious to get started. There is some homework involved, but in lesson 1, you'll learn what is a development plan and why you need one, and the reasons that people do get sidetracked. In lesson 2, we're going to talk more about who should be involved and where to get the information you need. If you don't have good records already, we're going to tell you some ways you can get the information you need. And then lesson 3 is what your plan should look like, including samples, and we're giving you templates that show goals, objectives, strategies, and action steps. And then lesson 4 is implementing and evaluating the plan. Once it's developed, who's going to implement it, and how is it going to be evaluated, and how should it serve as a guide for your next plan? So that's basically what the course is all about. If you need CFRE credits, if you're already a CFRE and you need to be recertified and you need some credits, or if you're going for a CFRE, this course has been approved, and all my courses have been approved for CFRE credit. So that's helpful to know. So what the course basically, I think, will do for most of you is stop the pain in your gut when your board members just come up with one more event for you to run or write grants all day long, and that's how you're going to succeed. So what does all this cost? Well, it's $199 for a 4-lesson course. And as I said, you take this on your own time. It's all packaged up that you can take it all 4 lessons in 1 week if you choose to. You can spread it out over 4 weeks or 4 months or 4 years, whatever. It's available to you forever. So it's all something that you can do online. And there's a lot of bonus materials included, like a lot of worksheets and, as I said, sample plans and templates to create your development plan. And there's also an online discussion group with me, the facilitator, that you can join and get answers that you might need as you go through the course. Now, today's offer that I mentioned, and I emailed all of you a special code for this. So if you didn't get the code, let me know after the webinar and I'll make sure to send it to you. But the regular price, as I said, is $199. But if you sign up right now while we're live, it's only $99. And when I say live, I know that some of you maybe haven't checked your email because you're busy listening to the webinar, and I understand that. So I actually will leave that open until it's 11, a little after 11 my time, Pacific time. So it'll be open for another hour. That coupon is good. So right after the webinar, if you haven't already jumped on and done this, you can sign up for it immediately after the webinar for the next hour. You'll be able to get that $99 price. And then if you sign up, I'll also give you that free board fundraising assessment form. That's a bonus that you'll be getting. I'll get a record of anybody who signs up, and I'll send you that immediately too. So I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. I think we might have some in the chat room already. I'm going to check that in a minute. But in the meantime, if you have to go, I know I said an hour and time for questions and answers. So if you do have to go before you get your questions answered, I always give people my email address, and you can feel free to email me at cvlinda@cox.net, or you can contact me through my website, which is simply lindalizakowski.com, or where my courses are all listed is Linda Lizakowski Nonprofit.Courses.Teachable.com. So you can contact me through any 3 of those methods, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you don't get them answered today. So again, I want to give you the link to sign up for that course, and then check your email for the special coupon. So I think we do have some questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go to that right now. The first one is, what advice do you have for the board and executive director, and what advice do you need to generate more board members? Well, I think to generate board members is I actually have a whole course in that too, in building a great board, which you can find at that website. And I did a webinar, which some of you may have been on building a great board, although the webinar focused on board giving. That was one aspect of creating a great board. But I think the key is to have a good, in a kind of simple form, rather than taking a couple hours to explain it. I think the key to building a good board is have a job description that really is adequate. Have a governance committee that focuses on board recruitment year-round, not just wait till the end of the year and say, oh gosh, we need to replace some of these board members. Who can we get? And what happens then is you end up getting people that, oh, well, how about my cousin or my neighbor? And they're people who really aren't interested in your organization. So I think that's a great way to get your board members more involved. And then once you get board members, then you need to educate them and train them too. Another question is, what percentage of the nonprofit budget should be focused on program versus fundraising? And that one is pretty hard to answer because every organization is different. And, you know, there's a lot of these kind of watchdog groups that say, oh, well, a good nonprofit shouldn't be spending more than 10% of their budget on fundraising, or 30% or 25%. And that is really a false claim, because every organization is different. For example, if you're a university who has been doing fundraising for years, you have a built-in alumni base, you don't have to go out and find new donors, you know pretty much who your donors are going to be, your costs are going to be lower. But if you're a small organization that's just starting with fundraising, you don't own any software, you don't have any donors in your list, you might have to do direct mail, which is expensive, as I said, to acquire donors, then it's hard to say. So there really is no adequate percentage that I think can be spent on fundraising that's really going to work for everybody. The link to sign up for the courses, somebody's asking me about that, and it's on the screen right now. And then do check your email, though, to make sure you got that coupon code if you want to sign up for it right now and get it for the $99 instead of $199. So the link is here and it's on the screen. And by the way, I almost forgot to mention, there is a guarantee of satisfaction on the courses. You have 30 days from the time you sign up for the course if you're not satisfied to get your money back. I've never had anybody ask for money back, but it is there, so you are aware of that. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat room if you have anything else that you can think of right now. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. Oh, okay. Somebody said they got something that said we couldn't find that page. You know, I have trouble with some of my browsers, so check the browser, but it's Linda Lizakowski. It's not www. If you're doing that, it won't work. It's https colon and then the 2 slashes, Linda Lizakowski Nonprofit Courses .teachable.com. And that'll get you to the general page, but specifically if you want to go to this course, you put in this /p/the-development-plan. So if anybody has issues, just email me privately at cvlinda@cox.net and I'll try to send you the link permanently. But I know a lot of people make the mistake of putting www in, and I do it myself because I'm so used to doing that. Somebody mentioned, can program salaries be positioned as part of the program budget line item? I think there's no reason that you couldn't, because obviously you can't run program without the salaries of the people to run it. So I would definitely say yes to that. Calvin asked, was the diversified development plan, what percentage is a good matrix? And that's hard to say too. If you look at the Giving USA stats that say 80% of giving comes from individuals, we should probably be planning on spending 80% of our time on focused on individuals. But that can be very different. Some organizations are very much dependent on grants, so they might spend more time on foundations. And again, it's kind of, you know, individual almost for every organization. You have to look at, I would start looking at what was been your experience in the past. And if you're not getting enough support from individuals and maybe focus more of your effort in that area. Oh, Lonnie just posted the link. Apparently she got in, he or she, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if Lonnie is a male or female, so I apologize if I said the wrong gender here. Could be either one, I know. But it's, as I said, Linda Lizakowski, Nonprofit Courses, that Teachable. So obviously you must have gotten into that. That's great. So I'm not sure if I've answered all the questions. Does anybody have any more? I certainly am open to taking more questions. Oh, here's another good one. What about the ED in a small nonprofit that wears many hats, including program? Can the ED salary be part of the program budget? I would think there's no reason not to. I don't typically get involved much with program budgets. I do more in the development budget. But again, wherever the executive director is spending their time, and probably the executive director is also spending his or her time doing fundraising in a small organization. So you might include part of their salary in the fundraising budget as well, because on your 990 form, I believe they might even ask that question, is where do you allocate the executive director staff, because some are more focused on program and some are more focused on fundraising. So these are great questions, by the way. I think you're really a great audience and getting some good questions in here. So if we don't have any more questions, I am probably going to stop the recording and close the class for today. But I certainly welcome you to contact me directly, and hopefully you all got your coupon in your email, and I'd love to have some of you in the course and see what you think of that. And I will be doing the next webinar is, I normally do them every 2 weeks, but I'm taking a little break. So the next one will be, I believe it's August 8th, but you'll be getting notified about that. I think I got a couple more questions here. Actually, no, it's a great job. Thanks. Thank you. And several people are thanking me, so I appreciate that. But I think it's been a great day, and I hope you all learned something that will help you carry forth. And I want to wish lots of luck to all of your development efforts. And I hope this evaluation thing, like I said, is a topic I could talk about a lot more. And I will be emailing you the slides. I'll actually give you a link because the recording is too big to email. So you're going to get the recording, the PowerPoint, the workbook in case you didn't already get that, the bonus philanthropic assessment form, and I think that covers just about everything. But you should be getting that link probably in about an hour or so. So again, thanks for your time, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in my next webinar. Thanks so much. Bye.